Greetings, Captains, and welcome to another video by STOBETTER. This will be quick because I'm sure all of you love spreadsheets as much as we do.
Daddy wants a spreadsheet?
Okay, good question. Maybe we'll go a little slower and add a few more basics. Spreadsheets give us a powerful tool to quickly apply lots of calculations. Today, we'll cover a spreadsheet we built and hosted on our site called TRINITY, which is a combined DPS calculator. If you're into the mathematical calculations of optimizing your build, this is the tool for you. Before we dive in, a few brief points on the best way to use TRINITY. TRINITY is great at comparing the effect of different stats on your build. Is 40% damage better than 5% critical hit chance? Should you take Duelist Fervor or Terran targeting systems? How about damage versus critical severity mods? TRINITY can give you a mathematical answer to those questions. TRINITY can also tell you what your expected stats for each weapon or damage source in your build are, up to a certain limit. This is especially important for fine-tuning surgical strikes or EPG builds near 100% critical hit chance. Since there's no overcapping critical hit chance over 100% in this game, you can use TRINITY to tell you how much crit is enough. TRINITY can also effectively model power levels and the impact of haste on your weapons raise. Now, TRINITY also has some limitations. If you're looking for a tool that will give you an estimated DPS for your entire build, you'd need to do a lot of tweaking to calibrate it to your piloting and target selection. In our example, TRINITY is going to show significantly more DPS than I've ever seen out of this build, because of its assumptions and limitations. For one, TRINITY does not model every damage-inflicting entity in the game, including certain powerful but conditional consoles like Agony Redistributor, or Hanger Pets, or recursive shearing, or summons, and a great many other things. We're always adding to and improving the tool, but some things don't lend themselves to a clean mathematical answer, and to some extent, it doesn't matter. TRINITY also doesn't account for piloting or budget, and by default assumes you're always hitting 5 stationary infinite hit point targets. It's a statistical model rather than event-based, so it's not emulating the game's flow on any given map. So why would you use it then? Well, to answer those stat-based questions like damage versus severity mods. Using the game would generally take lots of iterations, given that there's not a static testing map. Piloting variants alone will account for enough noise that the difference might not be readily apparent without lots of testing, especially for small number differences like the mod question, whereas TRINITY can give you a mathematical answer, especially for passive stat differences. Enough with the preamble, let's dive into the tool. You will likely need access to the game at the same time as you're filling out the sheet, either on a second monitor or in windowed form as I'm showing here. I'm showing TRINITY already up, but you can get this from the tools page on STOBETTER.com. To use it, go to File and select Make a Copy. Please do not ask for edit access to the master copy. Once your copy is made, rename it to something snappy and start filling it out. We'll be showing version 1.7.1 in this video, but don't worry, future edits won't drastically depart from this UI, and if they do, we'll upload a new video. Navigate to the Build tab and start with Weapons. The tool defaults to 5.3 Weapons layout, which is the layout of the ship I'm using, so I don't have to make the adjustments here for the ship. If your ship has a different layout, go ahead and set those drop-downs. Start by selecting your weapon flavor, be it phaser, disruptor, etc. Note that the tool does not support mines or calculating DPS for experimental weapons yet. If we add those in the future, it'll work the same way as the rest of the weapons. So next, select the weapon type, i.e. dual heavy cannon, omni-beam, etc. Terran weapons we model as having higher damage, so if you have Terran Task Force reputation weapons on your ship, you'll want to select the unique option for those, specifically the reputation set weapons. Next, fill in the mark and mods, and this is where either having the game window up or a second monitor or a notepad comes in handy, because I, for one, cannot remember all the mods on my ship at all times. If you have an unusual non-stat mod, like proc or arc, select other. If the weapon is a reputation weapon, and the reputation is leveled all up to tier 6, you'll also check the box for a tier 6 reputation weapon to add the 2% bonus damage those weapons receive. Lastly, some weapons have innate critical damage, specifically standard anti-proton, radiant anti-proton, and the discovery of wide-angle dual beam banks. The tooltip tells you which value to slot. You select that bonus here in column O. If you want to adjust for piloting, or if you have weapons in the AV slots, they're only filling a set bonus and won't fire. You can also adjust weapon expected uptime as a final multiplier in column P. For this ship, a 5-3 with 2 Omnis and a turret in the back, I'm going to model all weapons as firing all the time, but make the choice that's right for your build. With weapons done, we'll move to consoles. You'll select the appropriate number of each type of console in column B, be that universal, technical, engineering, or science. Then, select each console in the drop-downs. Some consoles, like my isomags, will have a secondary drop-down, called a conditional input. Here it's asking me what type of isomag I have, in this case, phaser. For this particular investigation, I'm curious as to whether the custom power matrix from the Helios is better than an isomag console, so I'm going to intentionally not fit exactly what's in my build for that 7th isomag instead. If you have a console with a key active, like Tachyon Net Drones or Domino, make sure that the active is set to on, unless you don't want to model its effects. Trinity will attempt to use unconventional systems to adjust uptime for those based on your input if you have it, so don't worry about that right now. If you come across a console that's not in the dropdown that you'd like to see included, reach out to us, either using the form on our website or via Reddit, but no promises depending on what it is and how easy it is to model. Now we move on to bridge officer abilities. Select your bridge officer traits in column B, then select their rank and career slot next. Note that hybrid specialization seats have a unique entry, so an engineering/miracle worker seat is a different option than just engineering. Once you select your station and career, fill in the powers. Column F has the ability name, and column H is where the rank goes. By default, Trinity assumes you generally have maximum uptime on abilities, but if you want to adjust that, we do provide that input in column K. And while we have a cooldown reduction calculator on our tools page, I've been told by our tools architect Jay that combining that into Trinity would either completely bog down Google Sheets or tear a hole in the space-time continuum. I'm not sure which is worse to him, but it's not good. Some bridge officer powers will specifically ask you for uptime modifiers. For example, anomalies can have their duration adjusted by the book trait. Firing mode powers like scatter volley will ask you for the time between uses. This is especially important for fire at will builds using entwined tactical matrices, as you'll want to cycle torpedo spread every 20 seconds instead of 15 for best results on fall uptime. It is very important you fill those out, especially if you're using a torpedo. Over to the right, you'll see the torpedo enhancement section, which allows you to assign torpedo modes like spread or high yield to various torpedoes. If you only have one torpedo, this is easily done, as in this case. On a torpedo boat, you might just leave them all to next available, or pick individual torpedoes if you plan on micromanaging your firing modes. Once that's done, we'll move on to traits. Start by selecting the correct number of personal traits. It's 11 for an alien, 10 for an elite captain or non-elite alien, and 9 for a non-elite, non-alien captain. The traits will have a brief description here, and just like consoles, some of them will have conditional inputs. For unconventional systems, you can either use the cooldown reduction calculator to get an idea of how many triggers you'd see between uses of the consoles, or else count it, or else just guess. Either way works. Starship traits and reputation traits work much the same way as personal traits, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering them. But now is as good a time as any to say that if any of the builds we have in our videos intrigue you, you can find long-form versions of them on our site. Depending on the video, the build might have evolved since then, but would generally link them in the description. After all of our traits are filled out, we need to fill in set bonuses. We don't have all set bonuses in here, just the ones that affect direct damage, and they're not automatically tabulated. In this case, the Lorca's Ambition 2-piece is the only set bonus in play, but there's room for many more of them here if you have lots of set bonuses. Now on to skills. The easiest way to fill out this section is to use the stats screen for your captain. You'll probably have to expand the drop-down to show all of the individual stats under Tactical Science and Engineering. And it's important that you're in orbit, in your ship, in a social zone for an accurate reading while doing this. Being on the ground or sector space will result in faulty numbers. Most of these are pretty straightforward, but you might have to go check your skill tree if you don't have all your skill logs memorized, or if you're a little distracted by something like kids in the other room. Please, don't hit your brother, and share your toys! Power levels are next, and that can be a little more interesting. You'll want to use the power transfer rating value at the top of the stats window in cell C138. If it's not coming out as a percentage, make sure that it's set as such by formatting it as a percent, or else weird things will happen as your power transfer rate will be off by a factor of 100. You'll then put in your maximum and available power for weapons and engines. Maximum power is generally 125 for both, but you could have sources of max power like isomags that increase it, or override subsystem safeties. Either use the value off of your power bar or math it out yourself. For available power, taking your restroom power and adding how much power you expect to have in combat will yield this value. This can be a little tricky, but adding your power bonus from emergency power to weapons to your current max power is reasonably close. I have emergency power to weapons 3, so that's 40 power. If you're an engineer using EPS manifold efficiency, add another 10 to both stats. If you want to find out your actual max engine power, drag the engine power slider all the way up and hit emergency power to engines to read the bar. Just don't forget to put it back when you're done. Now it's time to hit ship stats and power settings. This ship doesn't have any DPS adjusting mastery boxes, so leave all those blank on this one, but yours might have some applicable mastery bonuses. This next section covers power settings. Whereas the section above is concerned with maximum power and maximum available power on top of the max, here we're looking at current power, and it's as simple as reading it off of each of the 4 sliders. For weapon power, if you're not using isomags, you'll use 125 by default on an energy build. Otherwise, just read it off the bar. Next, we'll go back up and hit Endeavors and Devices. Select the appropriate Endeavor levels and the Fleet Combat Boost if you're using it. For batteries, Trinity will model uptime on the crafted batteries. If you want to use power level batteries, that would go into the power levels we set previously, rather than selected here, as the tool has no provision for raw subsystem power batteries. Moving on to drivetrain, there are only a few things here applicable to this build, most notably amp stacks, where you'll need to count the number of subsystem power levels above 75. The average shield percentage only matters for the prevailing resilient shield array. If this was on a science ship, you'd want to select your secondary deflector here and any relevant mods. Trinity only models deteriorating secondary deflectors because, as of this video, there's no reason to slot any other one, for 99% of all builds. There are a few more ship-specific items in the other category that again don't really apply to this build, but might for yours. If your ship is a full-spec temporal ship with support config, or has innate flanking, you'll want to select those options. Even if you're just using primary intel specialization for flanking, you'll want to enter a percentage of flanking attacks. Cruiser commands, ambush bonus, and full command ship inspiration abilities are also selected here. Below that, we look at captain career and specializations. If you're using Intelligence Agent Attaché, you'll want to set the uptime to minimum, as those represent the lowest possible cooldown on captain abilities. You can also set them to always on, you can set them to off, which is inactive, or averaged, which uses the base cooldown to determine uptime. This last one is what you'd want to use for builds without that trait. Engineering captains do not have an option to account for EPS power transfer here, as that's part of the whole power system, and is handled through setting the power levels above. Add some reasonable uptime adjusted power into each subsystem in the power section to model that power. It's 4.2 power to each subsystem at average cooldown, and 8.3 at minimum. Specialization comes next, and you'll have an option to select various stat counts on certain abilities, just like with captain abilities. I tried to pick reasonable values, but adjust as you see fit. We're almost to the end, only a few sections left. It's time for DOFs. You won't find most DOFs in this list because most of them don't directly affect damage. If you're running the popular chance of stacking crit DOFs, you'll want to note that the counter here is not the number of DOFs, it's the number of stacks of the buff that you expect to see on average. For torpedo boats, if you're using projectile weapons officers that have a chance to reduce torpedo cooldown, Trinity uses an approximation since it can't truly model RNG. Adjusting the reload DOF threshold will change the approximation assumption on when the DOF triggers. 30% is fairly low. Turning it lower, like 20 or even 10%, will increase the time between activations of the DOF, or slower cooldowns and worse RNG. Adjusting it higher increases the frequency at which the DOF triggers. In this section to the right, we'll add experimental weapon effects and weapon procs. Most procs don't really apply all that often, but on this build we will add the advanced inhibiting proc since we have a turret and it can be reliably procced, as well as the wide arc phase cannons buff. Now we just have a couple small tweaks to add. We'll go back up on the right side and stop at this scenario setup. The settings here are very powerful and we'd encourage you to not mess with them unless you're confident in your abilities. We left the defaults in column K for reference in case you ever do. The number of targets engaged at once will influence how much damage most exotic abilities and torpedo spread will do. If you tune it lower than 3, you'll see reduced output from scatter volley, lower than 2 and reduced output from fall. Ratio of shields to hull is how much do you expect to hit shields versus hull, and you can get a reasonable estimation of this by looking at a parser and dividing the number of damage dealt to shields by the total damage dealt. We set it at 0.3 by default, but it could be lower, especially on Infected or Kittimer. The target power levels, defense levels, and resistance are the default for non-stationary NPCs, so I wouldn't recommend adjusting them, but you certainly can. You can also adjust entropy stacks and your distance to the target. 2 kilometers is the optimal firing distance for energy weapons, and it's a final multiplier on energy damage, so changing it doesn't do anything when comparing A to B options on traits or consoles. I would generally leave that alone. Scrolling back up, make sure you don't have any missing conditional inputs like this missed value for the Lorca 2-piece, and then check out the final step. If you're only flying solo, you can leave all of these at 0, unless you want to account for debuff from hangar pets. If you're operating in a team environment, this will allow you to add team-wide damage contributions like attack pattern beta, intel fleet, or external haste like flagship staffing from other players. If there's a console we haven't added yet, or a trait, you can also model its stats here by adding the values in the various other fields. We don't have a specific field for flagship staffing, so I simply added 20% haste here, assuming that I'm going to have it in a team environment. Okay, we're done with the initial setup. If you made it this far, congratulations.
Daddy, I don't think there was anyone watching. I think they all left.
No, I'm sure everyone is still here. You are still here, right? Well, we'll pretend as if you are. We've done the setup. Click over to the Calculated DPS tab, and you will see what Trinity thinks this ship can do in this idealized scenario. It'll also tell you here in the green text if you're on the current version thanks to some magic from Jay. The tool will also calculate how much weapon power overcap it thinks you can use, your total DPS, and DPS for each of the major types: energy, exotic, and projectiles. It also attempts to calculate your average time between torpedoes and weapon criticals per second. If you want to save the results off, add a label in row 2, then copy your results from column C over to a new case. This next step is really important. You must paste values only, or use the Ctrl-Shift-V hotkey, or else the formulas will be messed up and the numbers won't make sense. Now, we can do our comparison. Remember that we're comparing an isomag against the custom power matrix. If this was just a simple trait swap, it'd be a little simpler, but we're going to do an isomag comparison so we can show the full process. Go back to build and adjust. I add the custom power matrix in the slot and update the conditional input to select all modes of that console active. Then I adjust my weapon power. I'm going to future-proof my weapon power for adjusting the number of isomags since I'll be pulling one off to compare against the custom power matrix. It's important that adjusting the number of isomags also comes with adjusting the available and max weapon power, and a simple Excel formula gets the job done more cleanly. I use 125 plus 7.25 times the number of isomags. But once it's done, that'll let me adjust the impact of removing an isomag more easily. Trinity recalculates and we get our updated numbers, which are showing that the custom power matrix is significantly better than an isomag, with all modes active. If you find a bug with the tool, and there are several of you who find new and exciting ways to break it every time we do a major release, please submit a report using our feedback form and we'll look into it. A few more final things before we close out. If you scroll to the right on Calculated DPS, you can see stat lines for each weapon, as well as which firing modes are active. The weighted value at the far right is the final DPS once all calculations take place. Below that, we do the same thing for exotics. The tool has a couple of graphs that show DPS breakdown by type, as well as a weapon power graph indicating how the engine is calculating weapon power. This is more useful for low weapon power builds like torpedo boats with some energy weapons to make sure you don't turn off your weapons by going too low on power. To the right of that, there's a module that will tell you, for your build, whether critical severity or damage is the better mod for your weapons. It says damage is better on this build. The same module also works for checking Spire consoles if you're trying to decide between exploiters and locators. Isomags will generally be better for most builds, but if they're out of budget or not better, then this tool can help. At the bottom, there are 3 more graphs. There is a detailed breakdown indicating where most of the damage is calculated to come from, and remember that Trinity won't have everything in your build. For example, the Pavin Omni proc is not in here. There's also a torpedo clock, which is useful in torpedo boats to ensure that all of your torpedoes actually fire without gaps between them, and an engine power curve for reroute reserve to weapon builds that functions similarly to the final weapon power graph. That was a lot of material, and I suspect that I've lost most of our viewership by now. Our chief video editor Tilor is probably about to ping me to report a steep increase in people unsubscribing from the channel. So let me close out by answering a fundamental question. Do you need to use this tool? Do you need to use Trinity to be good at STO? The answer is no. There are plenty of people in-game who hit the top of the leaderboard without ever touching a spreadsheet, especially not this spreadsheet. Trinity can't make you a better pilot or build your ship for you, but it can maybe answer some questions. If you're not a spreadsheet aficionado, in all seriousness, we get it. We do a lot of math and analysis using these tools and write up the results so you don't have to. All of that content is freely available on our site, either on our individual builds pages, or accessible from our guides page, where we link to various long-form discussion into game mechanics with conclusions and analysis at the end. We made this video for the few of you who really want to suss out how to use this resource, but while we think Trinity is pretty nifty, we're not here to tell you this is a must-have for good shipbuilders. We hope it's a useful resource for those of you who like to math things out, but as much as we love spreadsheets and math, we aren't offended if that's not your cup of tea. Speaking of a cup of tea, I think I'm due for one after all that talking and... Hey! What are you doing with that marker? Captain, if this breakdown helped you in your quest to play STOBETTER, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. The link to the specific build used for this tutorial is in the description. For more guides and builds, check us out at www.stobetter.com.